In an age when stone walls held both the memory of conquest and the scent of cedar smoke, in the kingdom of Israel, where olives bent under sun and merchants bartered beneath canopies, a son was born into the kingly house whose very hair would become a symbol and then an instrument of his fate. From the first, the boy was not merely noticed for his lineage. People spoke of him as if a light had walked into a room, and the market singers stopped to listen. He grew with a particular image fixed in the eyes of the city, a mane of hair that fell like dark silk, a pride that moved his shoulders as if he carried an unspoken crown. The palace corridors smelled of wax and roasted lamb and the parchment of urgent decrees, but where he walked, the air seemed to shift, as if crowds themselves leaned closer to catch his laugh. The story that follows will not be a litany of dates and battalions alone. It will be an account of beauty turned to danger, of family torn by silence, and of how the very trait that glorified a young man became the rope that bound him to a tragic end. He had been taught to stand tall from childhood, to tilt his chin in a way that made him resemble the painted princes in the murals of the city gates. In his earliest years, under the roof of the palace, he learned courtesy and song, the names of gods and heroes, and the weight of being an heir. As a boy, he chased dust motes through the banquet halls, smelled the sweet fig cakes that the steward Yonadab prepared, and listened while the harpist Eliab plucked at strings that made the portiers weep. He learned to measure smiles, to accept applause, and to turn a glance into a promise that made laborers lay down their tools to watch. The courts of the city were places of gold and murmured counsel, where the King David presided with a voice that had been honed in battle and prayer. The king was a giant in memory and presence, often wrapped in robes that smelt faintly of incense, and his silence could be as decisive as his commands. Around the royal table sat Joab, the general whose hands knew the heft of swords; Ahithophel, the counselor whose eyes cut like a whetstone; Hushai, the friend who feigned loyalties for the sake of the realm; Zadok, the priest who read omens; and Ittai, the Gittite, who pledged allegiance in full view of the gates. These figures watched as the young man grew into both charm and cunning, into someone who learned to enter a room and tilt the mood in an instant. The first fracture came as a private violence and then echoed out into the open court in a way no lawgiver intended. Amnon, another son of David, had harmed Tamar, their sister, and the palace corridors that echoed out into the open court in a way no lawgiver intended. Amnon, another son of David, had harmed Tamar, their sister, and the palace corridors that once smelled of cedar and honey, now tasted of copper and dread. The people caught the scent of injustice as they did the scent of blood, and the noise that followed was not the clamor of battle, but the tense hush that follows a misdeed known to all and punished by none. David, the king, carried the great fatigue of his reign on his shoulders, and though his heart may have broken, his public decision was silence. That silence landed in the young man as a verdict. It wrote in his chest a grievance and a promise. Wounded honor demanded reckoning. In the shadow of the throne, Absalom felt a shift that would rearrange the map of his heart. He withdrew to a dark corner of the palace gardens, where the night smelled of jasmine and distant sea salt, and he began to plot. His backstory unfolded in private scenes that shaped him like hammer and anvil. As a child, he had learned the rituals of the court, the prayers to the Lord, the recitations from the Psalms and from Chronicles that reminded the house of its battles. The first paragraph of his origin was simple tenderness. A mother who sang old songs by lamplight, a father who taught him the names of conquered towns and the price of mercy, and a tutor named Ephraim who introduced him to the law and the art of debate. Sensory details anchored those memories. He remembered the rough silk of his mother Maacah's lap, the bitter taste of tea offered by the steward Hushai in times of sorrow, the clink of sandals on marble at dawn as his father walked to the inner court. The second paragraph turned to formation. At 12, he began studying under the elders, learning to read omens and to speak in measured tones before groups. He learned the craft of public grieving and practiced speeches in the courtyard, watching how a lowered head could draw sympathy like rain. The third paragraph recorded the loss that would harden him, the assault on Tamar, the king's inaction, and the nights he spent listening to whispers outside the king's chamber, the air thick with lamp smoke and unspoken accusations. He tasted iron then, and the scent of ash when a torch was put out. The fourth paragraph connected past to present. These early patterns molded a man who believed that display could shape reality, that hair and beauty were not vanity but tools, and that justice could be taken by those who had the courage to seize it. The court itself was a theater of silk and steel, and the opening of the central conflict played there in plain sight. In the banqueting hall the long wooden tables shone with oil and fruit. The hall echoed to the clink of goblets, and the murmurs of merchants drifted in from the market beyond the palace walls. Absalom began to sit at the entrance of the city gates, under the noon sun, where he would tug at the beards of travelers, listen to their grievances, and promise solutions in a voice like warm bread. He cultivated an image that made the poor feel seen, and the nobles feel threatened without knowing why. The first seed of insurrection was not forged with swords, but with applause. Ahithophel advised the king at one point to take swift measures, and the king nodded and then remained quiet. Here is a sensory scene. The dust of the marketplace settled into his hair. The sweat cooled on the back of his neck as he listened. The scent of roasted figs hung on his breath, and the touch of the crowd's palm on his shoulder felt like a benediction. A crucial dialogue unfolded between Absalom and his servant Hushai, who posed as a friend but carried secrets back to the palace. Absalom said, "Why do you linger at the gate, Hushai?" "The city leans toward me," Hushai replied, "and your voice draws them like a summons." Absalom smiled and said, "They call me lord and prince, but not yet heir. I want them to know me, not as a shadow." Hushai answered, "There are those in the palace. Hubad observes every step, and Ahithophel listens like a dog to the scent of change." Absalom leaned closer and whispered, "Then help me to make the people see me as more than the king's son." Hushai placed his hand on Absalom's sleeve and said, "We will craft your image. We will weave words like gold and let them hang in the air." Absalom's laugh was low and confident. "Show me how." Hushai said, "First we let them taste your justice, then your mercy. We plant stories in the market and at the wells. We bring Zadok to smile where he has frowned, and we will have Ittai declare his loyalty." Absalom's answer was simple. "I have hair and a face and a way with crowds. Give me time and watch." The incident that most sharply turned private grievance into public action was as dramatic as it was human. In a night that smelled of wine and cedar, a feast became a platform. Absalom sent men through the city to bring those who held grudges into his orbit. He commanded hearts before he commanded armies. The betrayal came when Counselor Ahithophel offered advice that would cut like a blade. In a conversation thick with the metallic taste of trepidation, Absalom asked Ahithophel what course to take. Ahithophel said, "Strike now, and the people will not be able to assemble. David will wake to news and flee." Absalom replied, "That is sharp and quick, and the sword would end what we cause to begin." Ahithophel's eyes narrowed. Then he said, "The people need a sign. Let your father think you seek only reconciliation. Win the hearts first, and then bring him down." Absalom considered and then nodded. "This is counsel that pleases my thought." At about this point when the injustice has been set before you, and the young man has chosen a path between patient image-making and explosive retaliation, we pause to ask for your voice. If you felt the weight of the silence that followed the wrong as we did, know you are not alone. Which road would you have taken in the place of the protagonist of this story? Would you have pursued personal vengeance to make right an unavenged wrong, or would you have trusted the law and waited for justice to be served through proper channels? Write vengeance or justice, and add one sentence explaining why. Your words matter here because they shape how we see those who lived long ago and how we act today. Reading your view may bring comfort to someone who struggles with the same choice and will help us decide which stories to tell next. Now let us return and see how the plan was built and what it cost. Absalom's return to the public stage was a study in political theater. He grew his hair long until it became a brand. People noted how it swung when he rode and the way he shaded his face under the sun as if to magnify his presence. He sent emissaries to the border towns. He hosted feasts that smelled of saffron and myrrh, and he used banquets like nets, letting praise and allegiance gather like fish. The construction of his image involved named allies and puppet magistrates. Joab remained a man of weapons and whispered warnings. Amasa fled with awkward loyalty. Hushai, who pretended to counsel the king, fed Absalom the knowledge of court movements while secretly speaking to loyalists in the shadows. And Zadok the priest sometimes looked on with silent worry. There were conversations in low rooms where Absalom spoke plainly to captains and scribes. Absalom said, "We will not raise swords at the gate, we will raise voices. Let songs of our justice travel from the wells to the high places." Joab grunted and asked, "Are you prepared to take the field, should it come to blood?" Absalom replied, "My father will not stand when the people call him away. He will know grief, and he will be weary." Joab shook his head and said, "Beware the counsel of Ahithophel. He is like iron. If he crosses you, your doom will come like a storm." Absalom answered, "He is wise, but I am wise in the ways of the people. I will weave compassion with resolve." Hushai then added, "The king listens to the wrong counselors when his heart is heavy. Let me be the one who distracts him, and we will steer him away." Absalom placed a hand upon Hushai's shoulder and said, "Do not fail me." Hushai replied, "I will stand in the storm if you ask." Tension mounted deliberately across the kingdom. Absalom declared his intent in a fashion that was both theatrical and persuasive. On a day when the sun hit the city walls like hammered bronze, he stood before a gathering at the city gate. He spoke of wrongs not with bitter hatred, but with the fragrance of compassion. He promised that he would restore honor, that he would be a king who listened, that he would build alliances with the tribes, and restore justice where the mighty had been spared. The crowd, tasting the words like sweet wine, began to shift. A chorus of names rose: merchants like Raphael, soldiers like Benaiah, scribes like Azariah, women who tended the wells like Miriam, and elders such as Joash from the north, who nodded as if agreeing to a new covenant. Each voice added weight, each name was an oath. The declaration was a pivot, a mass that rolled toward a new center. When armed confrontation finally arrived, it was messy, loud, and close. The battle took place among hills and olive groves, where the wind smelled of dust and crushed leaves. Spears glinted like stubborn stars, horses snorted, and men shouted commands that were sometimes drowned by the pounding of many feet. Absalom rode with his hair flowing over the side of his cloak, an image of defiance and careless beauty.
In the chaos, there were moments of raw human exchange, cries and bargains, and the scream of a trumpet that seemed to pierce the sky. Joab, leading loyalists, and Absalom, leading his supporters, met in force and in rhetoric. In the thick of it, Absalom called to his captains, "How fares the left? How fares the right?" Amasa answered, "The lines hold, but men tire." Absalom cried, "Then push now, and the wall will break." Joab countered, "Move with sense, not frenzy. We cannot be consumed by our own rage." Absalom retorted, "Rage is a furnace that forges a new world." Joab shouted, "That furnace can burn the innocent too." Absalom's eyes flashed, and he said, "Let my hair be my sign. Let my name speak for me." After a turn of fate, Absalom's horse became entangled in the boughs of an oak. In his head, the world spun with the metallic taste of fear. His hair, which he had worn like a banner, caught on the branches and bound him as if the tree were a judge. He hung there suspended by his glory, visible to friend and enemy. The senses of the field closed in. The smell of dust filled his nostrils. The bitter tang of fear burned his throat. The rough bark cut his palm. The clatter of armor sounded like distant thunder, and the taste of iron was on every tongue. Job's men closed in. There were voices then, urgent and brief. A soldier said, "Kill him and end this." Absalom begged, "Not the man who stands against me, but spare me for a future repentance. I have been wrong, and I will change." Another called, "We must obey the command." Job then said, "No, I will not be the instrument of a scandal. That dishonors the king I will strike to secure the realm, and to end this sorrow." It was Joab who brought the fatal blow, and Absalom fell beneath the tree to the ground, the life leaving him like a lamp extinguished. The field went from shouting to a lugubrious hush, as if the earth itself bent to receive him. David returned then and learned of his son's death. His lament was as old as kingship itself, and smelled of ash and salt. He tore his garments and walked the city with a voice made small by grief. He wept aloud, saying, my son, would I had died instead of you." The king's sorrow rolled through the streets like a wave. The aftermath was heavy with consequence. The city and kingdom reeled. Some celebrated the end of rebellion, others mourned the loss and spoke of the cost of vengeance. Scholars and priests debated in the shade of the temple. Zadok read from the scrolls and invoked the Lord's providence, while elders like Joash argued for reform. The political balance shifted, alliances were tested. Ahithophel's counsel proved fatal not only to Absalom, but to his own standing, for his counsel had set in motion events that toppled more than one house. The priesthood sought to calm passions and to re-establish a sense of justice that was not merely the will of the victor. The people, who once cheered Absalom's hair as a sign of splendor, now whispered that beauty had become the very snare. There were long conversations in private chambers. David walked alone often and let the wind of the city touch his face. He felt the emptiness of victory and the hollowness of power. In the weeks and months after the battle, the kingdom attempted to stitch itself together. 1 month later, the streets that had chanted his name were lined with silent figures and freshly cut wreaths. Markets opened with a tentative air, people tasting normality as if it were a bitter medicine. 3 months later, some local leaders attempted initiatives to heal rifts, establishing councils where grievances could be heard, and assigning Zadok and other priests to mediate disputes among families. Long discussions took place in the houses of Raphael and in the shade of the city walls, where elders taught the young that justice required structures beyond the whim of a prince. 6 months on, the lessons were being taught in public squares and in schools. Parents told their children the story not only as a tale of tragedy, but as a parable about the peril of mixing beauty with unchecked power, and the cost when private vengeance is allowed to masquerade as public morality. These temporal epilogues carried senses and scenes. The smell of incense at a memorial service 1 month after the event. The taste of shared bread at the 3-month councils meant to bind wounds. The rough hands of teachers 6 months later reciting laws by which a community might avoid.
The king lived on, carrying a sorrow that reshaped his rule. The realm learned slowly that the truest form of justice required restraint, institutions, and an honest reckoning with the things left unsaid. From this tragic arc arises a lesson that touches our present. Beauty and charisma can be instruments of influence, but when they become idols, they can ensnare both the bearer and the realm. Justice and vengeance are different paths, and the choice between them shapes not only the fate of individuals, but the life of nations. If one thing stands out from Absalom's tale, it is that public image can be as lethal as any weapon, and silence in the face of wrong may seed 1,000 tragedies. If this story moved you, and you seek more narratives that link faith, history, and practical lessons for our time, subscribe to this channel and join a community that wants to learn from the past to act with wisdom today. Remember the sight of the young man caught by his own glory, and consider what in your life you let become too precious to be questioned.